Here we are in Atlanta, the capital of Georgia in the U.S. Today, we're going to talk about urbanization and the way cities develop and change over time. I'm Mr. Coulter, and this is Human Geography. Welcome to Unit 6, where we're going to talk about urbanization in cities. This is one of my favorite units because we get to dive into where people live and how cities are organized. We're going to start this off with 6.1, which is the origins and influences of urbanization. Urbanization is the process by which the population of cities grow. There are two dimensions of urbanization. The first is the increase in the number of people living in cities. So that means that more people are in these big cities that are growing. So people are having children, moving to cities, and we see that the number of people in cities grows. The other part is the increase in percentage of people who are living in cities. So this means that as the number of people living in cities goes up, the rural population goes down or stays the same, so more people around the world are living in cities. So urban growth. This is Mumbai, India, one of the fastest growing cities in the world. And we see that developed countries have a higher percentage of people in cities. But developing countries have most of the large urban settlements. So unlike in the 1950s, the largest cities were mostly in developing countries. Now, 8 of the top 10 cities are currently developing in 2020. We also see that the growth of urban areas in developing countries is the reversal of how it was in Western Europe. So we used to view it as a measure of development, where now the big cities are growing even before development catches up to it. And developing countries have the greatest increase in the number of large urban settlements. Half of that growth comes from people moving from the countryside, so rural to urban migration, and half of that growth comes from a high natural increase rate, so people having lots of children in those big cities. And as we look here, we see the percent of people in urban areas. Western Europe and Anglo-America are still the highest, but Latin America is quickly catching those two ahead of Eastern Europe. The Middle East is next, with South Asia is the lowest percent of people in urban areas. So when we think about cities, we need to go back to a concept we learned in Unit 1, which is place. And place can be broken down into the site and situation. As the AP College Board says, site and situation influence the origin, function, and growth of cities. So we can see this city right here. The site is the physical location of the place, but the situation is the importance of it placed on the river with the mountains nearby. We look at what is around that impacts the place itself. So when cities historically functioned and started in different places, it was important to their site and situation. So in historic function of cities, cities were often the location of industry or certain services, and they serve as the center of social and technological innovation and freedom. For example, we have commercial cities like New York. New York started as a Dutch colony in the New World and sprung into one of the biggest commercial centers in the Americas. Fresno and Venice are both examples. You can see on the right that Venice was the center of trade between Europe and the Ottoman Empire, and they traded fabrics and dyes, and were able to make that trip across the Mediterranean Sea in order to trade with the Eastern world. We also see industrial cities like Manchester, where the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution happened in the UK. Detroit, which was the auto manufacturing capital of the world for a time in the United States, and Los Angeles, although now known for its Hollywood ties, was originally an industrial city on the west coast of America. We also see that cities spring up as a place for primary resources. Places like Scotia, Minas Gerais, and Nevada City all sprung up around specific resources. Nevada City was the site of a gold rush that drove people to the west. We also see resort cities. So things that are based around people traveling for fun. Santa Barbara in California, Marseille in France, Las Vegas in Nevada are all resort cities. A resort city that would not be possible without the Hoover Dam and the power that's provided by damming up the river. You can see that these things can change quickly, as Las Vegas was just a few casinos only 60 years ago and now is one of the fastest growing cities in the United States outside of just the tourism side. We also see that cities are established as religious or government centers as well. We see Monterey, DC, and Brasilia. Remember that we said that Brasilia and DC are both examples of forward thrust capitals where you can build your city however you want because you want to model it around the new government buildings. Sometimes entire cities spring up around education centers like Palo Alto and Berkeley. Cal Berkeley is at Berkeley, and Palo Alto is the home of Stanford, both education centers on the West Coast. To understand why cities formed, we need to look to our oldest cities. The oldest cities in the world were formed around agriculture in the same river valleys that we talked about in the last unit, Unit 5, when we said where agriculture began. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, was one of the hearths of ancient world cities. Egypt, China, and the Indus River Valley all house the oldest cities in the world. We see that the oldest known city was around 10,000 BCE in Jericho. Ur is the first large walled city that we see based on agricultural trade. It was about 5,000 years ago. And we see that people had things built at the center of these cities as congregating places to trade and practice religion. A ziggurat in Mesopotamia was the center point. Here's a model of a ziggurat and its location in the center of the town. And you can see that it would be something people could see from miles away in order to come to gather at this place and trade and perform religious ceremonies. As we look at the way the ancient cities grew, we see that Athens sprung up around 2500 BCE. It was the first city to exceed 100,000 residents. Many of these cities were organized into city-states, where they were the capital of government for their local area. Rome was a city-state that eventually transformed into a republic that spread out and conquered territory and then became an empire. And it was the first city in the world to reach 1 million inhabitants. Think about how huge that would have been in 133 BCE for them to have the infrastructure, the sewage, and the water connection to support over 1 million people back before zero. And you can see some of the structures that still remain from that time today. This is the Acropolis in Athens. And here's the city of Rome, where they had a Colosseum the size of a modern football stadium in order to entertain the people of Rome. We saw that then, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, many of the people in Europe abandoned their cities around the 5th century. And then eventually the European feudal cities began to rise back up, beginning in the 11th century. And the independent cities formed as a way to protect people and then give military service to their feudal lord in order to bring people together to keep them safe inside these dense walls. But it's why European cities are so dense, which we'll talk about later in this unit, because they had to build denser and denser inside of the protective walls rather than outside of the walls where they'd be in danger. And this encouraged trade because they improved roads as a result of this. We see that still the architecture and design of cities is influenced by their medieval structures. In this case is Paris. You can see marking for the Louvre and the central city and the different levels of walls and the way that the city is still shaped around that original wall of the medieval city. This is Dubrovnik in Croatia, and it's actually the site of King's Landing in the TV show Game of Thrones because it shows such a clear delineation of where the city walls used to be. But these influences still impact our cities. Human beings came together in cities to protect the agriculture they grew in order to stay together and survive. And that staying together allowed skills and trade of ideas and the influence to create the modern world we live in today. As we continue in this unit of urbanization, we're going to learn more about the importance of cities and how people stayed connected. Learning about the origins of cities is just one step to better understanding our world. I'm Mr. Coulter, and this was Human Geography.